Good morning. Having my first cup of coffee from my Hippie Pots mug. And it is excellent. In the first comment, I will post a link to a TED Talk by Michael Brody Waite. The title is something like Run Your Company Like a Drug Addict. It is fascinating. This guy took the sense of urgency and hustle that an addict has to get that fix so they don't get heroin sick. And he applied it to running a business. And he's managed to turn something that's sad and horrible into something inspirational, which good for him. And I think you might like it. It's definitely worth the few minutes to watch. Being the sane adult in a family full of drug addicts has been quite a lesson in life. First off, I should say when this whole thing began for me, I had no experience with drugs personally, except that I had been in bands for years. You would see people just flame out, people who were incredibly talented, driven, motivated, but they could not kick the habit. And the habit would destroy them and destroy their relationships. And alcohol does something similar. So does gambling. I can remember having a sax player where I was never sure if he was going to have a sax at the time of the gig because he would pawn it to go gamble in the middle of the night after the gigs. That was wonderful. One time I had to go buy a tenor sax out of hock for him because he had pawned it. And the only way we were going to have a sax player that night was for me to go pay the money. Sort of like getting an alcoholic out of jail so they can go do something important. The sense of urgency and focus that an addict brings to getting that fix, and yet doesn't seem to be able to be applied to getting a job, picking up clothes that they've dropped on the floor, or any other area of life. It's infuriating. I mean, I don't have my act all together, obviously, but it's a sense of priority that has never made any sense to me, and I guess it's not up to me to understand. How do I start this story? I was a truck driver in the oil fields in West Texas for a few years. I would leave my home outside of Tucson and live in my truck for 5 weeks, a month, whatever, and then come home for a week or two. I always wondered what fresh hell I was going to come home to. Well, one of my sons decided that he was going to kick heroin and that now was the time, a couple of years ago. Took him with me in my semi. Fortunately for me, I had a job where I could have someone with and wouldn't hurt anything. I took him with me full-blown in his addiction. For the first week, he laid in the sleeper cab of my truck, screaming in pain and agony. Then he sort of came to, started to come around, come to his senses, and then he ate. And he ate, and he ate, and he ate. And normally I would go through about $100 a week in food for myself while I was on the road. This kid was eating over $100 worth of food every day, and I cooked in that truck for myself and for him. So it wasn't like we were eating expensive out-to-eat food. He gained about 20 pounds before he came back. But that first week, he was on the phone constantly to friends and family. Get me a bus ticket, get me a plane ticket, get me out of here, get me out of here. I didn't take it personal. But when he came back, I was so proud of him. He had a clarity in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a few years. And this is the kid that if I was ever going to just take somebody on a picnic in the desert and not come back with that person, this was the kid. This was the one. He came back with his wits about him, sane, having kicked it. We had been gone about 3 weeks to a month, and he had a zest for life and an excitement. And by the time I went back to Texas a week later, he was using again. And he was just as stupid and ridiculous and all the other negatives all over again, as if that time had meant nothing. And I was personally very offended by this because I had gone out of my way to help him. And over time, I realized I was taking pride in his recovery because I felt it reflected on me because I had had a hand in it. And it didn't stick, didn't go anywhere. And in the end, he was just as bad off as he had been a few weeks earlier. About a year later, he was at the hospital when his daughter was born, and he quit using heroin and meth. and everything else. And he hasn't gone back. He hasn't relapsed. He fell in love with a little girl, my granddaughter, who is perfect, by the way. She will outgrow this, I'm sure, but for now, she is perfect. But for him, that's what it took. And it had nothing to do with me and my good intentions, and it had nothing to do with his mom and her good intentions. And no amount of kicking him out of the house or getting him a job or talking to him, none of it meant anything. What mattered was he found something bigger than himself to live for, and it didn't require my participation. I'm proud of him. He's now in his early 20s, and he lost a good 5 years. He lost a good 5 years of life and growth. He comes to me every once in a while, and he'll ask me about this or that aspect of living an adult life. I try not to be appalled at the fact that he's now in his early 20s and he's just figuring out stuff that everybody else figured out in their mid-teens. But that's when he started really using, was his mid-teens. They say that an addict or an alcoholic stops maturing when they start using, and that when they get clean, they start over again emotionally at the time that they left off at. So he's been about 15 years old for 6 or 7 or 8 years, which is obnoxious. Very obnoxious. But I know people in their 40s and 50s who are about 12 and 13, which is equally obnoxious. You know those people where you just go, what is the matter with you? Well, maybe they never got past a certain point. Anyway, that's my 2 cents for today. That's what I'm thinking about. We're all just walking each other home.